Well, hello and welcome to the 2020 Academic Emergency Medicine Reviewers Workshop. Unfortunately, we couldn't be together in the spring in Denver, so we're doing this virtually. This is something that we will put online so you can refer back to it as a reference. And today we are going to have a special treat. We're going to have some specialty review sessions. I'm going to start off with a general overview of the journal and just some thoughts about what comprises an important and interesting manuscript. Then we're going to turn to three other expert presenters. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to start the slide deck. And our expert presenters are going to be Jim Miner, who's going to talk about the nuts and bolts of the basic review. And because we're getting more and more qualitative type submissions involving patient interviews, focus groups, and so forth, Steve Wall is going to go through a very brief tour of the elements of a good qualitative review. And also, we're getting more submissions that involve implementation, or they believe that they did implementation. And expert Kabir Yadav will talk about some of the basic elements that should go into a review of a project that proposes itself to be implementation. And these are the times. We'll go through this fast. And then at the end of the talk, there'll be a chance to ask questions. So let me give some context so that we can think about where academic emergency medicine is in the overall picture of manuscript submission. So for example, our submissions are up by over 30%. This morning, I decisioned manuscript number 1003, I believe, August 5th. There have been years that I've been editor-in-chief that we've only had 1,000 submissions during the entire year. And we have many months to go. So I anticipate that we will probably be over 1,500 this year. And so when you're reviewing a paper, think about the fact that our acceptance rate is really under 20%. So if we look at original contributions, which are about 75% of our submissions, their actual acceptance rate is more like 17%. The reason that the acceptance rate is even 20% is because we do accept a lot of reflections and correspondence, and they're really not that subjected to peer review. So, you know, it's getting difficult to publish in our journal. And one of the reasons it's getting difficult is we're a good journal. We are #1 out of all the emergency care journals in terms of our altmetric score. And that is basically the social media and lay press citations of our articles. And we're #4 in the impact factor. And for the first time ever, our impact factor is over 3 for the 2-year impact factor, and it's 3.4 for the 5-year impact factor. So more authors want to submit to us, and it's not just because of COVID, although COVID has definitely contributed to that massive increase in submissions we've had. And I'm just going to show you a quick slide so you can have an idea what's happening in 2020. The red line is 2020, and the y-axis are the number of downloads from our website. And you can see the previous 2 years are fairly flat. And in the last month, a lot of people are accessing our content, and a lot of people are interested in submitting. So you have the opportunity to be very rigorous in your reviews. And you can be a little hard because we're getting plenty of submissions. A reminder of the operations. I, the editor-in-chief, I triage about 55% of papers, so they never go to a decision editor. Somewhere around 40 to 45% end up on the desk of a decision editor, and they in turn triage about another quarter of what they get, so that they're only sending out ultimately about 35 to 40% of everything that's submitted to you, the peer reviewer. The point of this is that by the time it gets to you, we're pretty serious about this paper. We're not just asking you for some type of desk rejection. We think it's at least worth your time for review. And again, in terms of volume, I just checked our our log of papers, and we have set the September issue. And after September, we have 70 accepted papers to publish. And if we didn't accept another thing, it would take us about 6 months to use up all 70 papers. So we have a pretty substantial backlog. It's tough out there. So I'm going to end my 5-minute introduction before I turn it over to Jim Miner by saying here are 4 elements that I think you'll see across the board at any journal, or really even peer reviewing grants or any type of academic scholarly submission, that you need to ask, does the paper meet these 4 elements? And if it really fails bad on one of them, it needs to get rejected. And the first thing is, do you think it's interesting? And maybe I would add, possibly you could say, do I think others besides myself think this is interesting? And if the answer is, I think it's boring, and I think most people I know would think it's boring, pretty much that's it. You don't need to spend a whole lot of time reviewing this paper and finding diction problems and numeracy problems and things that don't add up in tables and figures. You pretty much know you need to reject if you don't think it's interesting and you don't think others will. And of course, is it somewhat novel? Does it present something, even if it's a valuable contribution in terms of repetition of something very important? Like an example might be external validation of an important decision rule. I mean, that it may not be a novel decision rule, but a well done external validation is novel insight by telling us that this rule really could become medicine. And in speaking of becoming medicine, the papers really need to shift or make you stop for a second and say, hey, I didn't think about that. Or I have been thinking about that, and this seems like a good idea. It seems like something that will change the way we think. So this is some direct language that comes off of NIH review criteria for innovation is, does this proposal challenge existing dogma, or will it shift the way we think about things? And rarely, a paper may even change how we behave, how we do things. But I don't really expect many papers to change behavior immediately. Most of our papers will change thinking, and a few will change behavior. And then the last thing to think about is just in the overall, were these methods and results rigorous enough to pass peer review now and in social media? And in context of COVID, I think everyone listening to this reviewer workshop will remember what happened with what I would call a debacle at the New England Journal and Lancet earlier this year, where 2 papers by the same group had to be retracted because the peer review process did not sniff out that the data really didn't make sense. But social media found it, and we don't really want our journal peer reviewed in social media, especially in journal clubs and places like that. So I want you to think ahead. How are people going to receive this, and what are they going to tweet about? And is there something here that's not making sense? So with those 4 basic elements, let's move on and talk about some more specific nuts and bolts of a good review.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Miner, one of the senior associate editors, and we're going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts specifics of doing a review. Reviewing, of all other things, should be fun. This should be an opportunity for you to read a paper in a subject that you're really, really familiar with and it's your area of work. So as we talk about some of the things here, keep in the back of your mind, this isn't supposed to be a big, painful chore. It's supposed to be fun. And while you're doing a review, if something seems like a big, painful chore to you, you might not need it in your review. This should be fun to do, and the stuff that you're having fun doing is probably most useful to everyone that's going to read your review later. And when you get a review, it's already been looked at by Jeff and at least one decision editor. So you already know it's good enough to publish at first glance. It's got a subject that's interesting to the journal. It's the right topic for us. You don't have to worry about that. What we need your expertise in is this internally and externally valid work. And you're an expert in this subject, so that's what we need you to weigh in on. We need you to form an opinion about whether or not it's important and whether or not the findings are valuable. and whether or not it fits with other manuscripts that could have been in the journal. So we really need you to kind of weigh how good it is, how much you like it, and tell us what you think. Much more important than your details, line to line on what could be worded differently or what little flaws you see, is that big overriding opinion of, this is great, I want to see this in here. Now, if you follow that with, and there's these 300 little mistakes I found that need to be fixed for sure, that's incredibly valuable. But that first thing that, yeah, we should publish this, is the most important, versus they made a fundamental problem with their paper here. I was reviewing a paper yesterday for a very technical basic science pain journal, and I was reading it, and I barely understood half what was in it, which I pointed out saying, as a clinician, I don't understand what you're talking about. But I noticed the doses they'd used had no correlation with clinical findings. And I said, they were comparing 60 milligrams of oxycodone to 300 micrograms of buprenorphine, which don't make any sense clinically. And that was what was valuable, because I was the only clinician reading the paper. The rest of it was scientists. And that's what the editor needed to know, not that I didn't understand the stats they use or their measurement device. So keep that in mind, that those little things that you think are obvious might not be obvious to someone who doesn't read papers on the topic all the time. So really judge the value of the work and confirm its scientific validity is your job. Now, when a manuscript has any statistical analysis in it, it gets a statistical reviewer. So if you don't understand the stats, you don't have to disqualify yourself from review or say you can't do it. You're still looking at the value of the work and the scientific validity. I will add the caveat to that is you should be able to understand the description of the statistics. And it's very valuable for you to say in your review, I'm reading this and it makes absolutely no sense to me, because it does not need to be a list of highly technical jargon. It should be something that you can read and say, oh, okay, I see what they did. You might not know how to do it, but you should understand what they wrote there. Now, what your review should include, first of all, is your opinion of the importance of the work, and that's the most important thing. Second, your determination of the work's quality. And finally, your specific recommendations to improve the manuscript. The way I like to do it is I read the paper once. I don't write anything down. I don't try to review it. I just read it, because so often I think I find a flaw and later on I realize that I didn't really find one and I've wasted a lot of time by jumping ahead. Just read it through. Then I make the decision, is this valuable or not? Sometimes I stop right there. Sometimes I'll say, this is boring. It doesn't make any sense. It's been done before. Their whole, proposition doesn't work. And I read a very brief review, basically saying, I read through this and fundamentally, this doesn't make any sense. You don't need to go back and do tons and tons of micro edits at that point, because it's going to get rejected. If you really think you found a critical error that won't move any further and there's nothing that can be done to fix it, don't put a ton of time into working on it. If the editor's going to accept it anyway, they'll probably let you know and say, well, what do you think about this, and here's the response. It's okay to stop there. So you got to make this decision. If this, could this information be used, and is anyone ever going to cite this? If this is valuable? And it's an important question to ask yourself. If you don't think anyone's ever going to cite something again, it might not be that valuable to be out there. And it's important to think, would you ever use this? Would another researcher like you ever come up with a use for this or explain something by citing this? It's an important way to think of it and puts it in context of, does this fit in with the body of work that I'm familiar with right now? After I get to the end of those questions and I've decided, it's got valuable information, somebody might need it someday, it's probably going to get cited, then I go back with a much more specific hat on and start taking notes and start keeping track of my review as I go. When you start your review, there's a part that starts with comments to the editor. And that's the part where you put your opinion of the value of the work. This is information that the editor needs that maybe necessarily aren't that constructive to give directly to the author. So this is great, this is awful. You don't want to say the author, it's great, because if the editor's going to reject it anyway, that makes things confusing, and the decision editor's going to pull that part out of the review anyway. Tell the editor what you think of it. Also tell him what you think of the limitations and flaws and whether or not they can be addressed. And this is your opinion. I detected these 4 or 5 limitations that the authors hadn't noted, but I think if they could adequately explain them, the paper will still be valuable. Versus, there's no way to move forward with this experiment unless they're misstated what their methods were, because this flaw is too big and they don't even seem to know it's there. those are okay. Your opinion of what those are, which is different than you describing what they are, right? You describe what they are for the author. You say what your opinion of them was for the editor. The other thing that's important for the editor to know is whether or not you think this should have some commentary. This is a really important question. If you get to a study where you're thinking, wow, this could change everything, you wouldn't necessarily know that just by looking at the paper. You might just want to write out, hey, put some commentary on this, because these flaws are huge and unavoidable. And we should talk about the fact that as this research moves forward, it has to be addressed. Versus, this is a very good finding that people will cite a lot, but there's not a lot here that needs to be opinioned on. When you're getting to the comments to the authors, I start with an overview statement of, I think this is a really interesting paper that's going to be helpful for the literature, something to just tie in my thoughts. Then I start with my critical concerns. These are the concerns that are my overriding opinions that need to be addressed before it can be published. The reason I write them first is it saves me a lot of time later as I write up my review. It's helpful for the editor because they can see it. It's helpful for me because by pointing out the overriding flaws, as I point out specifics later, they tend to keep tying back to that, and I can be much more brief in the rest of my review. So any overriding comments, to get them in right away. Then I move on to more major concerns, which are more like, you didn't address this limitation, the methods failed to describe that, there are variables in the results that are not described in the method, things that are really important and have to be addressed, but don't necessarily frame the entire nature of your review of the paper like a critical concern would. Then I get down to the nitty gritty and I go section by section, title, here's my comment, abstract, here's my comment, all the way through the whole paper. If I don't have a comment in a section, I don't write one. You don't even have to write specific comments if you don't have any. Usually you have a few. A lot of times you've kind of hit on them all in the critical and major concerns. But that's where I put my detail stuff down in the specific questions. And that helps, I think, a lot. It helps a writer because they can go back and see what's your overarching, you have to change everything complaints, and what's your go change this line. Because sometimes a critical concern will get lost in that we change this one word to address your critical concern, which is obviously inadequate, versus we rewrote the entire introduction because you had a specific question about one term we used. Classifying it for the author, I think, is very valuable. And we've all been in that position of rewriting, so we know how useful it can be to have it organized. As you go through your review, have a sharp eye for detail. You might be one of the last people to look at the paper really, really critically and find an error. We've all seen things published where none of the reviewers noticed an error. My overriding rule that I use is that I'm reviewing a paper for a journal. They've identified me as someone who's a content expert in that topic. Therefore, I should be able to understand everything in the manuscript. So a lot of my specific comments end up being things like, I don't know what you mean by this. I don't know what you're referring to with this. I can't tell what you're describing here. And I use that a lot because if you can't understand it as a content expert, nobody will. And there's a good chance if you can't understand it, it's either not very well described or they're kind of missing the point of what they're describing or they've made an error. So make sure that there's nothing in there you can't understand. It doesn't mean it's bad if you can't understand it, but I would note you can't understand it, and they should fix that so that a content expert in the area that's in this journal should be able to read it. As you get into specific questions, I try to word things as suggestions. This would be better if it's worded this way, this would be worded this way, or questions. What did you mean by this? I can't find the variable that's described in the methods it's described in the results in the methods, things like that. Requesting for clarifications is pretty much for anything I can't understand. I try to avoid instructions to make specific changes unless they do something that's just a pet peeve of mine. If they use the word, I do a lot of pain reviewing, right? So every time somebody uses the word narcotic, I say, could you please use the word opioid instead? But I try to keep those to a minimum, the specific instructions, because sometimes it's just a failure of me to understand what they're trying to say. For grammar and syntax, focus on whether or not their meaning is clear. You don't have to worry about the specific rules of the English language unless it's obvious and glaring, just because they'll be copying editing later, and that can bog you down away from the important part of your review, which is really getting into the nature of the content. How long should your review be? It just needs to be useful to the editor. Timely is more important than all-inclusive, and it shouldn't be biased. It doesn't have to be long. When I first started reviewing for the journal, about 25 years ago now, my reviews were pages and pages long because I didn't really know what the editor did and didn't need. And now my reviews are much, much shorter and probably much more valuable to editors because I know I have a pretty good idea what they're looking for and I have a pretty good idea of what nobody is looking for. Which is why I start with the general stuff and get down to the specifics later. Because a lot of times when I start with the general stuff, by the time I get to the specifics, I kind of have already covered it. And it's not that important anymore. Specific areas for comment are really the research question, its originality, the internal and external validity, the writing style and clarity, the presentation of figures, and any ethical concerns you have. When I get into the review, I consider each section individually and on its own merit. Every paper has to have an intro, a methods, a results, and a discussion. Look at the title. It's important to look at the title. Is it concise? Is it clear? Is it relevant? Is it catchy or snazzy? Or is it kind of losing sight of what the paper is really about? The introduction should really concisely form the argument for the study's context. In general, it should describe the internal validity of the study. There should be some background, but it should describe the logic for the study design, not the study design itself. That's for the methods. It should describe the need for the study findings, not the findings themselves, and it should clearly state the research question. You should clearly understand why they're doing the project and what their purpose is when you get to the end of the introduction. Sometimes they turn into mini reviews of the topic. That's not what it's there for. It's there to establish internal validity. For the methods, they should be specific enough so that someone else can come and do this paper again later, and that you can judge the nature of the findings and determine if they're going to be valid. All planned activities prior to data collection should be described. All of their subject selection, inclusion and exclusion criteria should be clear. Randomization should be clear. How the data collection was clear. You should be able to reproduce the study. We all know that, but it's easy to kind of lose track of that. And almost every paper that I edit needs some fixing in its methods, with rare exceptions. Usually they just forget some detail that you wouldn't know unless you were there. The data variables should be described specifically, starting with independent and then followed by the dependent variables. And every measurement device for every variable should be described in detail. The data analysis really should be more about the logic of the statistical tests specifically described. And like I said, you should be able to understand what they're talking about. A lot of readers are going to skim that section of the methods, but it's critical as a reviewer that you put your most attention here. This is the spot where you're most likely to find a flaw and you're most likely to find something that can really be better described to improve the paper. Now, authors can't change what they did, but they can modify the way they describe it to provide readers a greater understanding of the methodology. And a lot of times looking hard at the review finds previously overlooked limitations that the authors didn't even know about until you pointed out for them. Results are a little easier. Look at enrollment details. Information should either be in a text or a table, not both. And every variable in the methods, and only variables in the methods, should be described. Any data from statistical tests should also be in there. And there shouldn't be any interpretation. That should be in the discussion. Really the key thing here is if something's in a table, it shouldn't be in the text. And if something's in the text, it shouldn't be in the table. And everything in there should just be a copy of what was in the methods. There shouldn't be any surprises in the results. Tables and figures, well, it's easier to look at data when it's in a table than when it's in text. Graphs and illustrations, they really only should be there to emphasize key findings when a graphical demonstration makes it easier to see them. Figures that aren't essential to understanding the main results really should just be appendices, not, just online only, not part of the print. And really one of my pet peeves you really should look for is two-dimensional data should not be presented in 3D. It's super easy to do with the computer, but it doesn't add anything. It's somewhat deceptive. For the discussion, it's kind of the other side of the intro. It should describe the external validity of the paper, right? They should say what these results mean, why they apply externally, how they can apply externally, how it compares to previous and similar work, and where it fits into future work coming. But if you think in terms of the intro as the internal validity and the discussion as the external validity, it can help the authors organize their work into a much more clear format that explains it all for us to read and makes it more straightforward to determine the paper's validity. For the limitations, every study has flaws. A well-done limitations section is going to strengthen the study's validity by addressing these limitations and noting the effects on their findings. Sometimes people put flaws in there that are clearly not flaws, and they're put in as some sort of diversion technique to pretend like they have a flaw. Every paper has a flaw. And if they don't understand it, you need to help them get there. But it's a sign of an author not truly appreciating the ramifications of their work when they can't list the limitations well. So look hard at that section. A lot of times the limitations get written after you review, right? Because most of what's in the limitations is based on things that the reviewers brought up. And finally, the conclusion. It really should pull together what the research question was and what the findings were. It should almost mirror the research question. They should be very close. There shouldn't be anything addressed in the conclusion that wasn't asked in the research question. It should specifically explain the significance of the work as well. Typically, authors overstate their findings or add statements they didn't actually study, usually around healthcare costs, or this works great, or this is an awesome option, even though that wasn't part of the study. So maybe limit them to what they actually found and how it relates to the question they asked. Now, statements about new directions or implications should be clearly stated as hypothetical as well, meaning this indicates that we should do more work, really should be stated as an opinion, not as our findings indicate that further work is necessary, because it's rare that a study finding would actually indicate that, right? Remember, with the abstract, for a lot of our papers, especially nowadays, that's all anyone's ever going to read. And so it has to accurately demonstrate what's in the paper with the key findings. So I usually do the abstract last and say, is this everything that I agree with after I read that paper? And a lot of times you'll find stuff that doesn't really fit with what you got from the paper, or something that's a lot of times emphasized out of context. For the references, just make sure they're relevant and current. This is your area of expertise. You should be relatively familiar with a lot of the references. I recommend checking some that you've never heard of before, especially if they're on a key detail, because you often find stuff that's misrepresented. Or at least misinterpreted because they only read the abstract of the title and not the whole paper. And it's important to look at. It's time consuming. You're not always gonna have time to do it, but when you can, it's really important. Remember that you're biased, and remember that understanding your bias is the best way to account for it. You're gonna tend to like papers that grab a reader's attention, are clearly written, and have favorable results, and you're gonna give them a break, right? You're not gonna like papers with negative results, that they don't have a novel idea, or they make a lot of syntax or spelling errors. Try to put that aside and stick to the facts and the question and what they did. You don't want to have that bias in you. And if you recognize that you have it, this is a negative study of a boring topic, but it's super important in this line of research. You want to do what you can to make sure you give that a great review. Whereas they looked at the really cool technique with an obscure measurement device I don't understand, but I want to like it because it's cool. You have to force yourself to get out of that. And we know we do it just because every time they study review, that's what they find. But try to know that that's in your head and try to stay out of it. And once the editors get your review, what we do is we put all the reviews together. We try to look to make sure there's no conflicting statements that would confuse the author. And we get them, as much as we can, your review direct with very little changes. We really only change stuff if two reviewers had a completely opposite opinion of something. We try to find some sort of middle ground that will keep both reviewers happy. We also look at your review and grade it on a 1 to 5 basis. And we use those scores later to try to help us pick who we want to use as reviewers. If you want feedback on your review, contact the editor and they'll get back to you and tell you this was a great review, or I could use more detail, or you didn't have to give so much detail, but I appreciate your effort. But if you want that feedback, you can always get it. So finally, thank you for being a reviewer. It's essential to scientific progress. It's essential to the advancement of our specialty, and it's essential to making sure that the stuff that gets out in the literature is factual and true and holds up to scientific rigor. I have a reference here. Gus Gaumel wrote this paper about 10 years ago. That's one of my favorite review descriptions of how to do a peer review. I recommend reading it. Anyway, that's the end. Thanks so much.
Hello, my name is Stephen Wall, and I'm the decision editor for Qualitative Research for Academic Emergency Medicine. And I'm honored to be here today to present reviewing qualitative research with you. So just some disclosures and disclaimers. Qualitative research is by itself, inherently subjective. And there's a lot of terminology that are different depending on what source you read, but it means the same thing. So just be aware of that. And it's very important to note that any software that we're discussing, neither I or SAEM has anything to do with those companies. There's no relationships whatsoever. So I put this slide up because when Jeff asked me to give this talk, originally I was like, how am I supposed to tell everyone how to review a paper in 15 minutes when textbooks basically tell you how to do this for qualitative methodology. But I was really excited to do this because it means that qualitative research is actually hitting the mainstream right now and being recognized as important contributions to literature. So I will do my best to do so in 15 minutes. So first we're going to start with the scope of qualitative research. So it's important to note that with qualitative research, we're really looking at theory generation and exploration. So it looks into the insight into social, emotional, experiential phenomenon in healthcare. And also the most important thing to understand is that we're asking, as opposed to whether or how much, we're asking why, how, and what. I like this table. I took it from Chu et al. And Megan Rainey was also on this study. And it really highlights the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. And again, we have to understand that it's going to require different methods to come at our conclusions. And I think some of the highlights of this table are that in qualitative research, we're actually flexible in our design. So as we're actually accumulating data, we're analyzing it, and then we're also understanding and maybe even modifying our questions to make sure we're getting at what we want. Whereas in quantitative, it's very rigid. You have to have everything a priori. So, and iterative is a really important concept in qualitative research. That means we're constantly going back and circling back until we come up to a state where we are understanding what we're trying to study. So I have a sample article. If we have some time at the end, I'll try to go through some concepts. But I think for independent study, you can look at a paper that I co-authored. I did this with one of my residents years ago. And by no means is this a solid qualitative paper that even we would accept in academic emergency medicine. But I think it is a good idea to kind of go through and you can see where there are strengths and weaknesses of the paper and how you might actually critique whether or not the paper, future papers would be valid for our journal. And in that, what we actually did was we looked at, in Gabon, we were actually looking at EMS there. And they introduced what's called SAMU, which is essentially the same as any EMS in our country. And what they noticed is that despite them integrating it into society, no one was really calling it. And they wanted to know why, so they could actually spread the word and see if they could get more people to use it when needed. So we're going to go through now the evaluation components of a qualitative paper. So the first thing you would do is say, okay, well, was the study designed to address the research question? And were the objectives appropriately conducted rigorously enough to achieve some empirical aims? So essentially, how were the study participants selected? Were the methods used? What were the methods used to generate the data? Was it comprehensive? What were the procedures for data analysis? And did it corroborate findings within and also externally to other literature? And of course, you have to scrutinize for ethics as well. So when you're doing qualitative research, you're looking at a different sampling strategy. This is very counterintuitive because I find that when people come from quantitative backgrounds, they just don't, they have a trouble understanding the nuances here. So we're talking about purposeful sampling as opposed to trying to get a sample of everybody that could possibly contribute. In qualitative research, you might be only having like 20, 30, even 15 interviews, depending if you're doing an individual or a focus group study. So you have to purposely select folk that will have some homogeneity so that you can make some conclusions about a subset of people. And then the next study would go to the next subset and so on, as opposed to trying to do this all at once quantitatively and stratifying after the fact. That's a very key important concept here. And what you might do are typical cases, unusual cases, maybe politically important. Sometimes people call it snowball sampling, where one person will for the next person. So why is this important? So maybe I'm studying something of a rare disease. So people would self-refer into our studies so we could better understand those people. And what you would want to do is make sure that in the article that there's a proper description of this and that it makes sense given whatever is being studied. Were the data collection methods appropriate? So the most common methods that are used are field observations, interviews, and document analysis. And you don't necessarily have to have one or the other. Oftentimes it'll be a stronger paper if they corroborated all three into one, but that's not essential. When you might need to have video is when you're looking at maybe facial expressions. Audio, you can actually figure out emotional valence and sarcasm, but they're not essential. So field observations are useful. It's sort of that fly on the wall phenomenon where you're in there and you're just observing culture and what ongoing. So perhaps you're wanting to study in your emergency department people's perceptions of the doctors, whether or not they are working hard. And you can kind of just look at them and listen in on the conversations and take some field notes. Or you can observe the patterns of how physicians are walking around the ER and attending to different patients and whatnot. And so those would be rich descriptions. It can't just be like little basic notes. It has to be really rich descriptions of the field notes. You also have to acknowledge that you are the person taking field notes could be interfering with the culture, and you have to acknowledge that as well. Now, again, it doesn't obviate from being able to do the study, so long as you acknowledge how it might have impacted the results. So interviews, there's two different types. I mean, there's more than two different types, but we'll focus on these two different types. There's semi-structured, and that tends to be informed by theory, and it's deductive. And I'll tell you, most of the qualitative literature that we see in the medical journals, I believe, is more semi-structured, informed by theory originally. And the other one would be an inductive, where you have no understanding or limited understanding of what's going on, and you tend to just start from scratch. And that's where grounded theory comes in, where you're doing inductive generation. And so there's no theory attached, but you're developing your own, and then you'll extrapolate to other theories later. And we'll get into this in a few minutes. So individual interviews, well, that's really important if you want the personal experience, and especially if you're doing sensitive topics, like, for instance, if you're interviewing patients with sexually transmitted diseases or HIV, you know, you certainly wouldn't want to have people in a room where they don't want to divulge. In my particular line of inquiry, organ donation is also a very sensitive topic. So that really is what comes into play for that. Otherwise, you can do focus groups where it's nice because you get interpersonal dynamics. But again, you have to make sure that people can speak candidly. And another pitfall here might be if you have leadership and subordinates in the same focus group, then the subordinates would be fearful of any retribution. So that's also a key issue to look out for. So document analysis is just that. You take existing documents and you can still do rigorous qualitative data analysis of these records as well. So then you want to ask yourself, was the data collection comprehensive enough for your descriptions? And again, I alluded to this before, you really want to make sure that you get at least a homogeneous group where you can make some generalization within that group. And they talk about breadth, which are the types of observations, and depth. So the extent of each observation is very important. So for instance, you really want to know if a person interviewing is experienced and they're able to get at least 20 minutes of data. If there's only 2 minutes of yes, no questions, that's a problem. And that leads me to the other point, which is if you look at an interview guide, you should never see a yes, no question. It has to be why or what, or how did this impact you? And then you get more richness. And again, you want to, if you are going to make any comparisons of subgroups and margins, as long as you have those categories accounted for richly enough, then you're fine. But you have to make sure that that data you're collecting will at least have the capacity to do so. So here's the key point, is where the data appropriately analyzed. So when we talk about qualitative data, it's coding the data. So you have textual-based data. So generally what you'll do is you'll highlight that data to see if it's relevant or if it grabs you. Then you'll go and organize that into some themes. And then you'll start building those themes into a theoretical construct. And you can also use what's called network analysis to make sure that your constructs are actually correctly generated or validated by the data itself. You want to make sure that there are multiple coders who independently code the data, or they come together and they also negotiate the coding, and that there was memos documenting their decisions. That's a key point. As far as double coding and agreement goes, this is not essential, except if you have a concept where you're actually quantitatively coding the qualitative data. Then you might want to have kappa statistics, but it's not necessary. It's more about negotiating content. And again, it is an iterative process of data collection, analysis, interpretation, and then you might go back and collect more data until you've heard enough. And what does it mean by that? It's theoretical saturation. There are other names for this. There's informational redundancy, also thematic saturation exists in the literature. And it's really when no new information or change in interpretation results from additional data collection. That's the concept that we're looking for. And that's when you stop collecting your data. And then you want to make sure that the findings in the paper were adequately corroborated. So look for summary paragraphs with representative quotes to justify conclusions. Was the theory presented and related to other known theories explaining similar behavior, or do they have to generate everything from scratch? That's grounded theory. So one of my pet peeves is when they say we used a grounded theoretical approach, but the data in the surveys were informed by previous data. That's not grounded theory. It's still qualitative analysis and a qualitative study, but it's just not grounded theory. Oftentimes I've been trying to, when possible and appropriate, have a network diagram showing the behaviors of the participants and the theories that explain that. We don't need extensive tables of all codes and quotes. In fact, I would say that oftentimes when you look at quotes that are not actually looked within the context of the entire study, that it can often be misinterpreted. So I noticed some journals actually require that. We are not requiring that except when we find it appropriate. But what we want is a table with representative quotes that will justify or be an exemplar for the construct that's being mentioned. And then there's something called triangulation, which is really just corroborating a findings using multiple sources of information or looking at different ways of analyzing data. You can actually quantitatively code your data and also qualitatively code it as well. I think what's key is it is a bit of a leap of faith when you are reading these papers, but I think it's less of a leap when you notice that among the authors, there's someone with a PhD or sociology or psychology, whatever the field that's pertinent, that audited the coding scheme, okay? And you should also make sure that there's adequate explanation of the experience and training of the coders. Culture and language issues are key. So for instance, you might need to have someone who's actually of the same language and culture to understand idioms, but oftentimes you don't want them to be too embedded in the culture because then they might take things for granted and not have to explain. So it's always a balancing act with these studies. And I think one thing that I do ask, which is not a deal breaker, but it is nice when findings are presented to the participants for feedback and approval, because that also justifies that what you said was actually represented by the participants. As far as software goes, it's not essential, but it's really helpful. And I would say in certain research, it is essential. So for instance, if you're doing a semantic analysis or for efficiency's sake, you can actually have an autocode for certain phrases. It uses what's called regular expression algorithms to do so. It helps organize the data with memos and auditing. Someone else could come in there and look at the scheme. It helps build networks and associations, filtering, exploration. And these are just some packages. By all means, there are others. I prefer, there's Atlas TI and NVivo and Deduce, which is actually a less expensive web-based application. Transana is useful for video. And it might be that in the future, we might expect these bundles to be de-identified and given to qualitative methodologists for a quick review. I noticed that NIH is doing that for quantitative data, so that might be an issue. Other challenges are now the mixed method studies where you have both qualitative and quant in the same study. Now you have to have two different methodologists reviewing these papers. Again, the other issue is balancing word limits in the main documents, which what we might expect in the supplements. I try to really balance that as well for people who might want more in-depth that can look at the supplements. And really, there's no standard way of terminology in the qualitative research. So we also want to remind ourselves the overarching theme of whether or not we want to accept a paper applies. It might be a beautiful qualitative paper, but so what? It may not be applicable to us as emergency physicians. And as far as evaluation checklists go, we have what I grouped it is for the qualitative methodologists, we have what's called COREG and SRQR, but the NICE, which comes from England, really, or the UK, really seems to be appropriate in a more condensed version for anyone who's reviewing a paper, but not necessarily charged with scrutinizing its methodology. And again, I have this example here, which people are free to look at. What I'm going to do is go through the results of the paper, just give you a perspective of what the summary might look like. So in the methods section, for instance, in our study, we had emergency room patients and they voiced their opinions. We actually did it either in the hospital or at the point of care in the ER. And all of them were deemed sick enough to warrant using SAMU. We recorded the interviews in French, but they were transcribed verbatim and then translated by a fluent interviewer and then double coded and negotiated with content adjudicated. We found these are the overarching themes or constructs, okay? So the construct is a social and financial, and then the theme is within that construct. So that's no insurance coverage, taxis more affordable, family members' vehicles used. There might be some beliefs and misconceptions, so they were unaware and they didn't even think that they were medically equipped. They thought they were actually roadside assistance vehicles. And as far as structural organizational, the roads often were not even accessible to SAMU, and so they actually thought the taxi was faster and more convenient for them. This led to some ideas about an intervention that might be used, and it's all summarized here in bringing it back to theory, which is called a Haddon matrix. The Haddon matrix is used for injury, but it also could be prevalent for public health reforms as well. And you can see where some of these theories, like the media campaign or personal health behaviors, improving road infrastructure, can actually balance into what's known about the theory of disaster behavior and accidents and injuries prevention. And then this was actually the campaign that they did. They actually had a media campaign, and they also shifted towards having four-wheel drive vehicles and also motorcycle ambulances, which seemed to help. So I want to thank you, and if there are any questions, we'll do so later.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kabir Yadav. I'm one of the decision editors at Academic Emergency Medicine. I'm going to be talking to you today about how to review an implementation science paper. So basically, we'll talk a little bit about how implementation science fits into knowledge translation. We'll discuss a bit about what implementation science is, how to tell if a paper you're reviewing is an implementation science paper, how you can ensure appropriate methods and design are being used, and some common pitfalls. So to start, it's just good sometimes to take a step back and look at the knowledge translation cycle. And that begins with the research question. Most of you are probably very familiar with the first part, which is doing a particular study to demonstrate some efficacy. And then where things kind of fall apart is at number 4, tailoring and telling others, how you actually get the knowledge out there, how you actually try to get to changing practice at number 5, and then how to sustain that knowledge and reevaluate as the evidence base changes. So this is a knowledge translation, and where implementation science tries to help is at the last 3 points. And a different way to visualize this idea when it comes to knowledge translation is the knowledge to action cycle. So this framework assumes a systems perspective and situates the knowledge producers within a system of knowledge that's responsive, adaptive, and unpredictable. And you can see that everything sort of feeds on itself. So this is the idea of moving evidence to action is iterative, dynamics, and complex. And what's important is to understand that healthcare professionals and organizations behave in ways that are interdependent, and that knowledge of those processes is important to actually change routine clinical practice. And so understanding that as you actually try to do a behavior change or an intervention is important because you need to understand how the intervention changes and is affected by the system. And just as a side note, while we are talking about knowledge translation and how implementation science fits into it, there's at least some in the field of implementation science that try not to use the word translation because it often gets confused with translational research. But for those of us that think about it, knowledge translation and implementation science do certainly fit well together once understanding it from a systems perspective. So what about implementation science itself? A good definition from some of the leaders in the field is implementation research is a scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice, and hence to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services and care. And that's a great definition. And just one thing to point out is that often people focus on the evidence-based nature of it, and sometimes researchers may delay studying implementation because they're working from an incomplete evidence base. However, you can design a hybrid approach where you actually combine effectiveness and implementation research such that it's possible to move ahead with implementation as the evidence base is still expanding. So where's the science in implementation science? So it is in the theories and frameworks that explain the mechanisms of action and address uncertainties. It is in the concepts that are logically consistent, clearly defined, and lead to testable hypotheses. It is in the methods and concepts subjected to peer review and evaluation. And it's in the data collection and analysis methods that are transparent to allow replication. So really, implementation science has twin goals. One is to generate reliable strategies for improving health-related processes and outcomes, and to facilitate widespread adoption of these strategies. And the other is to produce insights and generalizable knowledge regarding implementation processes, barriers, facilitators, and strategies for success. I said theory probably half a dozen times, and the reason is because it is a major distinction of implementation science. And there's actually two different groups of theories that are important in implementation work. And those are prescriptive theories and explanatory theories. And a prescriptive theory is how we will implement and measure impact. So it tells you how to plan, organize, and schedule implementation of a particular intervention. And then the explanatory theory is why an innovation or intervention will meet a need. And so that is the how and why an intervention will lead to desired change in individual or population health. What these allow you to do by understanding human behavior and systems change is it helps you identify where an implementation might fail. It also then gives everybody a common understanding of how to share the learnings across studies, projects, and contexts. And by better understanding the change process, you can identify which implementation components were successful and which were not. So what are elements of implementation study that are key? So one is methods informed by relevant conceptual frameworks. Two is an examination of mechanisms of impact and contextual influences on implementation effectiveness. Third one's very important, which is actually measuring implementation outcomes. So these are a couple that are common to see. Acceptability is understanding from the people upon whom a change is being asked, how acceptable the intervention is. Adaptation is how much the intervention was modified, perhaps from its original evidence-based framework or guideline to meet the needs of a particular system under study. Adoption is how many people in that system actually took upon the intervention that you were trying to provide. Fidelity is from when you started the study, how much the intervention actually changed in trying to get it to work. Sustainability is how a particular change continues after the research infrastructure is dismantled to see how long it persists. And scalability is understanding how a particular intervention can be both spread within a health system and then across health systems. Scale and spread is sort of the phrase used often. And then lastly, studies the influences on provider, patient, and organizational behavior in order to make those changes. So again, the goal of research and implementation science is not to determine whether an implementation strategy is effective or not. It's really to understand how that strategy works in a complex healthcare system, and to ultimately provide guidance on adapting, modifying, and customizing it by providing an understanding of how it worked, so the strategy can be more effective in other settings. So very briefly, I'll also talk about how quality improvement and implementation science are different. This is probably a picture that's familiar to several of you. Quality improvement commonly targets specific local quality problems via rapid cycle iterative movement, such as this PDSA cycle. Implementation science can sometimes look similar, but this is fundamentally different. Implementation science generally seeks to develop and rigorously evaluate fixed implementation strategies to address implementation gaps across multiple sites. In this respect, the goal of implementation science is to develop generalizable knowledge. Because of these differences, there are opportunities for mutual understanding, and there's sometimes opportunities to change a project that initially is conceived as quality improvement, but then with some methodologic rigor and focus on scalability or spread can actually be an implementation science project. So for you, so is this paper QI or implementation science? So here's some things to start with. So did the authors develop an implementation strategy? Did they actually talk about how they expected the change to affect the system, and did they understand how the system would take on a particular change? Did they evaluate the implementation itself separate from the intervention outcomes? So were their implementation outcomes measured? And does the manuscript adhere to an appropriate reporting guideline? So for implementation science, the one I would suggest you use is available on the Equator website. It is the Standards for Reporting Implementation Studies, or STARI. Full disclosure, Chris Carpenter was part of a group, multidisciplinary talented group that actually developed this, but it is excellent and well worth your time to familiarize yourself when evaluating an implementation science paper. So how do you ensure appropriate design and methods for an implementation science manuscript? So one, it should reference existing implementation conceptual frameworks. There are many that are appropriate for a healthcare setting and well validated. So they should reference those. The embedded study design itself, if it's looking at an intervention, should stand up on its own as an intervention approach. So while I suggested you use the STARI checklist for understanding the implementation strategy, it's also good to consider the intervention itself using an appropriate checklist. So if it's an RCT, consider CONSORT. If it's behavior change, consider WIDER. If it's interviews and focus groups, consider COREG. If it's an educational intervention, consider GREEP. And lastly, if it's actually not implementation science and actually quality improvement, then you can use the SQUIRE checklist. And I just want to end with some common implementation pitfalls, other than the fact that the title just says implementation, but they aren't actually doing implementation science. So one is lacking a conceptual framework at all. Sometimes they may have thought that the audience wouldn't be interested, so it's always good to ask rather than just say it lacks. And then the other thing is that you want to make sure that they're not just name checking an implementation theory, but not actually employing it. So make sure that they're actually discussing how that theory informs the work that they're doing. An important other pitfall is missing key implementation outcomes. So this can be both for a study that didn't show an effect, but it could also be for studies that did show an effect. So a study that may have failed, not because the intervention wouldn't have worked, it's because the rate of adoption was so low that it never had a chance because nobody actually did it. And then the other thing is the fidelity checks. It may work, but what actually worked may not have been the intervention that was originally employed in the study, that it went under so many changes and iterative refinements that what actually worked wasn't the intervention that they intended to do. And then another pitfall, particularly with the focus for implementation science on creating generalizable knowledge, is a lack of focus on sustainability, what things are actually necessary to make this work elsewhere. And then also key elements of scalability. So not just reproducing it at one site or another site, but how to actually scale it out to an entire health system are other common pitfalls. That's it. Happy to answer any questions.
So that concludes our lecture portion of the reviewer workshop. And what I would like to do is now open up the microphone and the chat session for you to ask the experts any questions that you might have.